Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and today we are excited to talk about one thing that we're super passionate about, and I know our guest is super passionate about, and that is American Single Malt. Way back when, episode 63, we actually had this distillery on. For those who are fans of the Bourbon Lens, that would be Westland Distillery. And today we are joined by Matt Hofman, co-founder and master distiller of Westland. So Matt, thank you so much for joining the Bourbon Lens.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we were doing some prep before this, and we were looking back. Like, this was the first episode that launched right after the pandemic for us, and so we were getting used to this. And I remember the conversation with your team around, like, hey, this COVID thing's real, and it's breaking out here, and we don't know what's going to happen. So, lots happened for Westland in the last 2 years, but what's been going on in Seattle and for you all over the last 6 months, because I know it's been an exciting time for Westland.
Yeah, well, there's a ton going on. We've launched a new flagship single malt. It's just called Westland American Single Malt. We just call it our flagship whiskey. It's out there with a $59.99 suggested price points, which we're really, really proud of. For people who are fans of the American Oak, Sherrywood, and Peated, and I know you guys talked about that, those three whiskeys. So this will be a new flagship product. It's a new entry point, but we've also got more limited editions coming out too. We've released a lot of new single casks. Our different editions of Gariana continue to come out every year. We launched a whiskey called Colere, which is made with different varieties of barley during the pandemic, and we're just getting ready to release our locally peated whiskey called Solum. So made with peat that's from a bog, just a 90-minute drive from where we are here in Seattle. So really, really stoked for that one. That's been like a long time coming, that project. So, you just kind of, we're a whiskey distillery. So you just kind of keep trying to do cool stuff. And as soon as you have enough ready to bottle, we just kind of get ready to do it. So here we are.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's exciting. And, you think about all the, things that have come over the last 2 years, right? There's been these kind of marching orders as, you all and Westward and Boulder and Santa Fe Spirits and yada, 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 yada. We can rattle off the whole American Single Malt Whiskey Commission list, right? And we've kind of stomped through them as a podcast and learned and grown in this thing, but it's all been leading up to really the precipice of the TTB, taking this open comment period and really establishing rules and regulations for American Single Malt. And I think, Scott, you said this on a podcast. You're like, this might be the first time since bourbon, like in the last 100 years, that the TTB has defined a spirit, right? So like, this is huge news if you're not up on the spirits game. Like, people may be like, oh, it's American Single Malt, it's cute, but like, this is a huge deal, right? And it's taken a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bourbon was made Bourbon existed prior to the '60s, of course, but was made an official spirit of the United States, I think, in the early '60s, and that's really the last time something of this magnitude has come out from the U.S. Government when it comes to spirits, or really any government that I can really think of. This is a really big moment that we're in right now, and it's been a lot of work. American Single Malt. The first American single malts were made back in the 90s, and things have really, really accelerated and kind of gone exponential in terms of the number of distilleries making single malt. You've got guys making just a handful of casks every year. Now you've got, as you guys have pointed out before, now you got even Jack Daniel's is making single malt, one of the biggest distilleries in the world. So now you have this whole spectrum, which I think is beautiful. I think the category is made better by having all these people jumping in on it. And it's very dynamic. And we are at this point, as you said, where we're now able to capture what is happening here in terms of the definition. So we wanted to make sure that before things got out of hand and this category really kind of took off, that we didn't get to a place where people could frankly take advantage of it. And the easiest place to look at that, most notably, is in Japan. The Japanese whiskey scene, if people aren't super familiar with that, there's amazing whiskey coming out of Japan, but there's also, in the Japanese whiskey regulations, it's so loose that people can and do ship whiskey in from Scotland and from Canada, from the US, from Ireland, and bottle it and call it Japanese whiskey perfectly legally. So we wanted to make sure that, yeah, when you buy American single malt, you're buying it from an American producer. It was made and matured in America before things either got out of hand or before somebody tried to define it that wasn't like working for the benefit of the whole category. And that's, to your point of like all of these other producers of American single malt, we all got together to do this. And yeah, now we're in this really critical juncture where the TTB finally said, okay, here is our proposed standard of identity. Here is the proposed rule for those words on the label. And it matched the definition that we as a commission proposed entirely. So we're in the midst of that process right now. This is, we're living through history. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, you got to think about it. Like there's got to be a point in time when you all started Westland, right? And you all started this conversation, you're like, damn, it's like almost you're like mission to the moon type of like ideology, right? Like it's history in the making, and not many people get to make history, right? Like that's pretty cool to be a part of a team that is making history like happen. And America's obviously super young compared to the rest of the world. Like, let's not get that twisted, but like, it's really cool to make history in any statement, any opportunity whatsoever.
Yeah. I think to be really clear, the magnitude today of what we're kind of seeing, and like, we can kind of view it if we zoom back and imagine ourselves 30 years from now and be like, okay, yeah, this is making history. Like when we started it, that wasn't, part of the ambition of like, oh, let's make history. It's just like, no, this makes sense for us to make single malt whiskey where we are here in Seattle and in this country where, we have one of the best barley growing climates in the western part of the US. We should be making single malt. It was really that simple. And now all of a sudden, yeah, we are living through this. But I think that's to me, that's the most exciting thing. One of the most exciting things, certainly about American single as a category, is that everybody is jumping in and is not afraid to kind of to push it a little bit, and it's, there's a lot of, whether it's rules that are written down formally or it's the unwritten rules as like baseball players would say, it's like, there's things that, oh, you just can't do that because the culture of this type of whiskey says you can't do that sort of thing. But that's really given people an energy who's jumped into it and said, okay, let's create it. And that is what has made this so dynamic. It's such an interesting thing to live through, not only as a participant in that, but also as somebody who gets to drink those whiskeys from all sorts of different producers.
Yeah. And you mentioned something really interesting. And a lot of people may not know what's happening in Japan. And we had Brandon Smith, the Daily Dram, also out of Bardstown Bourbon Company, come on, and he talked to us about Japanese whiskey. But do you find it paralleled really interesting? Because their regulations are supposed to change. Did you see that kind of happen when you all kind of started to march forward, that like, hey, like they needed to put their foot down on regulations because America's starting to do the same thing? Or did you just kind of see that as that was going to happen because it needed to happen kind of thing?
It's difficult to say, if I'm honest with you, because I think I want to say that what we are doing here in the American single malt category definition is without parallel in a lot of the modern spirits world. And maybe it's like the audacity of just saying, oh, let's just create this new category, which is actually not functionally that complicated. But I think that's the beautiful part of America is like, we can do it. That sense that, well, what should be a classical sense of American optimism. But definitely the thing that's happened now in Japan, which is not quite the same thing actually as what we're doing in the US, because I think it's not, my understanding is that it is not coming like from the Japanese government. It's not involved with the Japanese government. It's more a trade organization sort of thing. But, that could work as well.
Yeah.
Whether that was influenced by us or not, it's really hard to say. I can definitely say there's other spirits categories much less well known than Japanese whiskey, which is of course massive for people who are in the business. But there's the English are doing this, the French are doing this. They're all trying to come up with a similar structure because they see the benefit. And I think that's a great thing. So long as it doesn't become prescriptive. It should be descriptive. It should be capturing what is happening and making sure that those words like American single malts, single malt means something to consumers of whiskey around the world. You can't change that. You can't get cute and clever and say, no, actually single malt means this now. No, single malt means one distillery, means 100% malted barley. We have to respect the history and culture of whiskey. It's American. It should be made in America. And so we just try to capture the fact that people are already doing that in this country. If a country started out and they said, oh, we are French single malt, but we're the only French single malt distillery out there. And by the way, it's not going to actually be single malt at all. It's going to be made out of rye. I don't think that's quite the right move.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about it being prescriptive and descriptive rather than restrictive, put up the guardrails before, like you said, before it gets out of hand, before somebody starts doing some crazy things, and tarnishing the American single malt category, which is something you guys have been embracing and putting on your label for forever, right? Or, for as long as you've existed. But you don't want somebody to come in and screw that up. So go ahead and put the guardrails up now. But the way the guardrails are written, they're not saying you can't do this, this, this. It's still leaving a lot open for exploration.
Yeah, you could definitely still screw up with the American single malt definitions. You can hold to that. And the same with you can in Scotland, like everything that we do, everything that's been in a bottle of Westland, if we were a distillery in Scotland, you could be able to call it Scotch single malt whiskey. So a lot of what we are doing that is different is what I would say is a cultural difference in terms of how we approach the raw ingredients that we source and things like that. And I would say the same is true for most American single malt producers, with the exception of pot stills versus non-pot stills, the only real major difference. But I think the thing is like, we want innovation is the great strength of this category.
Yeah.
Like what is happening in American single malt. You've got, distilleries like us that are really rooted in trying to like express this place that is the Pacific Northwest. You've got places also like us that have coming from big beer influence, Westward and Stranahan's doing the same thing. You got the guys in the Southwest doing stuff with mesquite smoked, and this happens all across the country. And so that the beauty of all of this diversity of American single malt is what, as a whiskey drinker, I think attracts people to the category, is that it's so open in terms of the approach. So we don't want to ruin that. I mean, that was like literally the first thing that we said when we got all together was, this is the special thing that we have going on that we're all doing is it is so different, so diverse, so complex. Let's make sure that the regulations we put in place don't get in the way of that. So that does still allow people to make whiskey in a way that, make mistakes. Like I've had some terrible Scotch whiskey, like from distilleries that were like really unfunded, underfunded and things like that. It's rare these days to find that sort of stuff, but like, there will be distilleries that will make mistakes, but I think if you keep it open enough, all these, when you buy a bottle of American single malt, when you read those words on a label as a consumer, you're going to get what you paid for. It's made in America. It's single malt whiskey. And I think we're all just set on the idea that the cream will rise to the top and consumers will select whiskeys that they enjoy ultimately.
Yeah. And, I find that to be super interesting because the American single malt category can be a lot of different things. And then there's riffs on the American single malt category, right? Like New Riff just announced today, like their malted category, like they're doing that. Frey Ranch is doing that. They're like malting different grains to, kind of riff on what has become this American single malt category, but showing different grains from a malting perspective. And I think people are interested in not only the innovation that's happening in American single malt, but the riffs that are happening in that as well. And you mentioned Jack Daniel's, right? They're triple mash, but they also, announced their own single malt. And MGP has their own single malt, right? So even these mass producers of global whiskey are saying, hey, there is something here with what, this American Single Malt Commission has like started to like, we need to be a part of this because this is history in the making and we can't rest on our laurels. And I find that to be beautiful, right? Is that no matter who you are, you're finding a way to be a part of this movement that's happening in America, not just to be a bourbon or a whiskey producer, but an American single malt producer or a malt producer of some sort.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing like consequence. I mean, the first time I heard that Jack Daniel's was making like American and single malt, I was just like, how am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes, you are.
How fucking cool is that? That like the biggest distillery in America is making a single malt whiskey. And, and I've never tasted it. I have no idea what it tastes like, but it's going to come out next year is my understanding. And I'm sure there's other distilleries doing it too. So how cool is that this is happening? And just as a spirits drinker, period, like that this category is evolving. But the thing you brought up with New Riff is super interesting. But by the way, I love New Riff in general as a distiller. I think they're super cool. But this idea of like, okay, malt, like as a general concept of where flavor comes from. I mean, malted barley, when we think about single malt whiskey, yes, it is malted barley, but malting a grain does very interesting things to your ability to generate flavor, especially when you get into the place where you start creating additional flavor compounds with we call the Maillard reaction. So that's the roasting of the grain and things like that. So when you get into crystal malts and roasted malts, things like that you can only get with once the grain is malted, not so much when it's just raw. So the fact that you see distilleries like New Riff and other ones that are bringing in like caramel rye or malted rye, like that's super cool. And I think that's the fun consequence. And you never would have thought about that as like as a side effect of American single malt. It just injects a little energy into the whole category of American whiskey. Is like, oh, what if we just think about this as a source of flavor, and not like there was any problem with the way whiskeys were, not at all, but also like imagine what could be, and how fun is that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna just say this because like I love the Pacific Northwest, and Fallon, Nevada is pretty close. They have a full lineup that would be a bourbon, but they malted every component, and it is the wildest whiskey I've ever tried in my life. They malted the corn, the barley, the rye, the wheat, and it is gnarly. But like, that's what's cool. Like the innovation, like I love the fact that like you all are working to define that. And I say we as just a consumer, like we drink it. Like we've all defined it of like, hey, like we can do some things that Scotch is doing, but we can do it a little bit different because we're America, right? But like, hey, let's riff on this because that's what America is. Like, hey, let's set some rules, but let's have fun. And I think that's so cool that like distilleries are like, hey, we don't want to produce a single malt, but we want to produce like, hey, malting is fun, and malting has shown like what you can do with barley. Let's try it with the other grains. And so this is my end of that conversation. But I think it's just really cool that these producers are doing cool things, as well as Jim Beam's done it with, their last little book, To the Finish, and all the different wood finish single malts that they put in there and then mixed it with bourbon, right? Like it's really cool that Freddie No has even said, hey, American single malt's a big thing, and I want to put it in my limited edition that I put out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just in general, it's like this is America, kind of to what you said. This is what we do, is like we can we're not beholden to these hundreds of years of tradition. And yes, there is that, the history of bourbon is getting older. It doesn't quite match the same history that exists in Scotland and Ireland, but that's not fair because how could it possibly do that? But also, like, you can have all those, the historical aspects of whiskey making in America, but that doesn't have to be it. We can keep going,
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, there's a lot of amazing stuff you can have in the history and tradition in American whiskey, in Scotch whiskey, but you can keep going too. Let's make the world, a bigger place when it comes to whiskey. So that's super exciting to see.
Yeah. And talk about exciting, right? I think a lot of people like hear this term American single malt and they're like, what is it? So we're 18, 20 minutes in and we're like, we've fangirled over this a little bit because we're all super excited. So, Matt, can you just break down what American single malt is? Like Scott can tell everyone because he does the bottled and bond Pledge Allegiance every day for bourbon. Can you tell
every
us
morning? Every morning. That's how I start.
Yeah. 9 a.m. the bugle plays and he recites it. So can you tell us what the proposed regulations are and what may come out of this comment period?
Yeah. So what we propose, when I say we, I say that is the part of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, of which Westland is a founding member. There were 9 founding distilleries. That was in March of 2016. We created the definition. The membership now is more than 100 dues-paying members of American single malt distillery in the country. We believe there's more than 200 distilleries making single malt in general. But it's actually very simple. And that's kind of the whole point of making this definition. Let's capture what is happening here and make sure it matches the consumer definition of single malt. So first of all, it's single malt whiskey. So what that means to consumers all over the world, single means one distillery. That was created originally because a lot of Scotch whiskey was blends. So when you say, well, it's not just a blended malt, it's a single malt. So it's one distillery. So that's right there. Malt, 100% malted barley. That's what it has always meant. There's other grains that can be malted, yes, but traditionally when we talk about single malt, it is always malted barley. So those are the two most important things right there. The third most important right alongside it is it's American single malt. So it should be mashed, distilled, and matured in America. Now, this doesn't mean that it can't be bottled in other places, which actually gives us some opportunities for things like independent bottlers in other countries, which is something that we all wanted to make sure was allowed to happen, that we could mature things in America, but also, send it to a place that, independent bottlers is a huge part of the whiskey business, especially in the UK and other places. So those are the big three. Beyond that, we have 40% ABV bottling strength or more, which is for all whiskeys in America, that's a no-brainer. 700-liter oak casks, which is pulled directly from the definition for single malt in Scotland. Now, these can be both new and used oak, charred or uncharred. So this is a big part of the flexibility that we want to have in American single malt and separates us from the American straight malt category.
And for those who don't understand the metric system, 700 liters is at least how many gallon?
How many freedom units is that? That'd be about 160, 150. It's divided by 3.785. So
we'll put the math in the show notes.
Yeah.
I just had to ask because I'm American.
It's a pretty damn big barrel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a common sized barrel.
How many eagles per hot dog is that? So, make sure you keep that in the edit.
We will. Yeah. Don't you worry.
As long as it didn't peek out, I can probably keep that.
Keep it in no matter what. And then the last thing is the maximum distillation strength of 80% ABV. Now, this is really, really important. This one in particular is why I left it for last. In Scotland, the definition says you need to use pot stills, and that's for a very good reason, and that is to make sure that you're retaining the flavor that is coming from the distillate, because the alternative that really popped up around the tail end of the 19th century was grain whiskey, of course. And grain whiskey is what went into blends. It's in your Johnny Walkers and so many other big famous brands. And those are produced on column stills and are distilled to a very high strength, usually 94% ABV to minimize the flavor, which makes it lighter and frankly a lot easier for most people to drink. So the idea of single malt being just pot stills in Scotland was their way of saying this is how it retains flavor. Now in America, we already have a system that does that, and that's with the maximum distillation strength. So we've done that with bourbon, we've done that with straight rye. And when it came time for us to create this definition, there was a couple of points that we really wanted to make sure of. The first one was there's a lot of different still types in use in America. There's people using pot stills, there's people using hybrid stills, and there's people using column stills. We wanted to make sure that this idea of single malt whiskey was open to everybody, but that idea of making sure that it retained the character of the raw ingredient that Scotland had, which is the whole reason for the pot still definition, is a good one. It's a good thing to have in there. So the fact that we've already have this framework in American whiskey legal language is perfect. So we said, all right, let's make it the same as these other American whiskey categories, 80% ABV, maximum distillation strength, but you can use any type of still. And we got almost universal acceptance for that. So that's it. It's these 6 things that were proposed. The TTB, when they opened up their proposed rulemaking, they matched our proposed definition exactly, which was super, super exciting. They could have proposed an American single malt rule that was in opposition to what we were doing, but we worked hand in hand with the TTB. This has been a 6.5-year process, so we worked hand in hand with them over this time, and they've been great. To be clear, it's been slow, but they've been great to work with. And then there's these comments that come in, at the last second they could change something. But we are very hopeful and cautiously optimistic that when the final thing is ruled on, which could happen very, very soon from where we are at this point in time, that it's going to match what we proposed from the outset from the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be exciting. Scott, as a lawyer, right? Like, you have to be kind of like nodding your head, like, this is the government and this is a 6-year battle and conversation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've never dealt with regulations on the federal level yet, but even on the state level, which is something I'm very familiar with, to get 4 paragraphs changed in a regulation took me about 2.5 years. Just all the comment periods, the revisions, the rewritings, the making sure it plays well with all the other regulations, because that's a big part of this.
That last part is actually super important, because the TTB said the same thing to us, is make sure it fits in with the language that they use for other regulations. So in addition to the fact that the pot still thing versus the 80% ABV gave us more flexibility as producers, it also matched the way that they define and regulate the other categories, namely bourbon. Like if we said that it was only pot stills for American single malt, then they have to go, well, shit, now we have to define what a pot still is. And that becomes a whole cascading, complicated thing to do. So fitting it into the language that exists within what the TTB is comfortable with. They made that very clear from the outset. But they were also very good about making sure that, they said, look, make sure you have 2 things. When you come to us, make sure you have 2 things. Make sure you have industry consensus, which we tried very hard to do. Make sure that as many producers of American single malt were on board, let alone all the other people in the trade, retailers, bartenders, things like that. And also make sure that it benefits the consumers, which clearly it does, because it's all about making sure the words on the label mean something. So yeah, it's been good. They've been really great to work with.
Yeah, no, the regulatory process is not an easy one. But if you can take language that already exists and morph it into what is needed, something that's already a baseline established and that they're, like you said, already comfortable with, adjusting that to what you need is very helpful and helps speed that process along. Now I know you said 6 years, but that's what 2 administrations and however many election cycles. So yeah, that's part of it. The unfortunate truth too, there's other dynamics that are at play outside of just let's talk about whiskey and get some regulations on the book.
Well, and the other thing that happened was we had a once in a generation event where the TTB opened up their books for changes in rulemaking for the first time in, I believe, 34 years, where they were working through a huge backlog of other changes. So that, this is where things changed most notably relevant in my world is like different bottle sizes are being allowed, like 700 milliliter bottle sizes. But there was like at least 100 different things that were like proposed changes, whether to labeling standards or whatever, that they were working through first and are now getting to the single malt thing, just kind of on the tail end of it. So yeah, they've been doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting, and you mentioned the 700 kind of milliliter. Like, when you think about the single malt category as a whole, right? We'll drop the American part, right? You look at those Scotch whiskeys, right, that you may be compared to. Like, do you find that like easier to like say, hey, we're conforming, or do you, is the 750 kind of here to stay in the American single malt category, do you think?
I bet within 5 years, every bottle of whiskey sold in America will be a 700 milliliter bottle.
Yeah.
Every bottle.
I agree.
American single malt, bourbon, anything. It's just because the rest of the world operates on a 700. And it's just from a raw logistic, it's silly that we operate on 2 different, systems, in the US versus everywhere else. So just to make it like super simple, and especially for small distilleries, like order sizes, if you're a really large distillery, you can get your price per unit down on packaged goods. But when you're a small distillery and you have to have 750 for a domestic product and 700 for an export product, that's a really difficult thing to do. So it's going to help a lot of small producers, most notably for their export business. And that's the fun part about, single malt, is that not only do we have a lot of opportunity to reach American consumers of whiskey, but, single malt is huge in a lot of other parts of the world. And that's that's a big part of, we believe American single malt will be not something that is just relevant to American consumers, but, will be something like Japanese whiskey where, if you're drinking whiskey around the world 5-10 years from now, you will also think of American single malt.
So that's
this might be the last time we reference Jack Daniels in an American single malt podcast, but Jack Daniels, one of the world's largest producers, recently switched to 700 milliliter for their most recent releases, the Bonded series, and nobody said anything about it. And it kind of just went under the radar. So I completely agree. 700 milliliter is where everything is going to go, because it's going to create one bottle that can go across the globe. So
it also helps for whiskey drinkers who are out there will now be able to get access to bottlings from smaller distilleries abroad who can bring them in. This was a thing where smaller, unique, especially like independent bottler stuff out of the UK, and they were going to put it in 700s so they could ship it to any country that would take 700s, but it literally was just not worth it to put it in 750s, even for the American market, which is of course big and very influential. So this doesn't just help us as whiskey makers. It helps, you guys, well, everybody as whiskey consumers to get access to more interesting things of smaller producers from around the world. It really does benefit everybody.
So one of the things I find interesting, right, is we define this category in the United States as American single malt, right? Obviously, Scotch is king in the single malt category, right? And then you have your Irish single malt, you have your Japanese, you have your Taiwanese, you have your Indian, and American, right? And I'm sure there's others that I don't know, but those are the ones that kind of stick out to my brain and the whiskeys that I have tried. Like, where do you think this will elevate American single malts to from a global perspective in that hierarchy of top 5 types of whiskeys from around the globe? Because you'll have regs and everything will be standard as you push out into the world, not just in America.
The regulations themselves won't accomplish the putting the American single malt whiskey on a map globally. That is only going to be done with high quality whiskey sold to people around the world in sufficient quantities. So it's going to do a lot of things. I think in America, it helps people put the framework together for what that is. But the thing that I always come back to, we use this analogy a lot, was something called the Judgment of Paris that happened in, I think it was like 1974. And it was when a British wine merchant took American wines, and it was Californian wines, of course, up against their French counterparts, and with French judges, mind you, and did a blind tasting of Californian wines versus the French wines. And he was British merchant, so he was in the middle, I guess. So the American wines won this competition, and the French literally refused to print it in their newspapers because it's like, how is this possible? But it wasn't about, okay, yes, a couple of these wines beat the French. I'm using air quotes here, beat the French in terms of who won that day. But it was more just like at this moment, Californian wines had arrived, or American wines had arrived, and they're different stylistically from each other, but the best of them can go toe to toe. And that's really where the wine industry began to change, and New World wines began to be taken really seriously. And that's already happening. Luckily we already have the Japanese whiskey scene, which has broken through that in terms of single malts for us. So that actually makes it a lot easier for us as American single malt producers to come in and have that conversation with people. But the framework, the structure, the standard of identity allows us to go out and say, hey, when we say American single malt, it means this. And then the quality will rise from there. And I'm so absolutely confident in this category as being, 5 years from now, we're on the back bar of every serious, an American single malt is on the back bar of every serious whiskey consumer, around the world. In 20 years from now, we'll be going toe to toe all the time, if not sooner.
Yeah.
So one question I wanted to ask about, as we draw some parallels to the Scotch whiskey world, because it's unavoidable, but in Scotland, you've got the regionality of Scotch whiskey, right? You got Highland, you got Islay, you got across the board, Speyside. I couldn't recite them all. Do you foresee similar characteristics across the U.S.? Now, I know the U.S. is a lot bigger than Scotland, but I kind of envision a day where people are going to identify American single malts by their regions, Pacific Northwest, Texas, Eastern Midwest, things like that. So do you foresee that kind of being a thing?
I think so in time. But again, I think this is another example of it'll be best if it is descriptive and not prescriptive, right? I mean, we don't want anybody getting in here and saying a Texas whiskey needs to taste like this, or a Seattle whiskey needs to taste like that. That at this stage of the game would be wrong. I would argue that at any stage of the game is wrong. I think that goes against kind of like a lot of the American mindset towards these sorts of things. I mein, and it starts to get pigeonholed in certain places, Napa, Cab Sauv, Oregon Pinot Noir, things like that. But I think needs to happen naturally, because the honest truth is that you can make single malt whiskey, world-class single malt whiskey, anywhere on the planet. So people can make whiskey that has no natural local stylistic impact at all. And it could be, from a liquid standpoint, a great tasting liquid. So if people as consumers want to value that, they need to be kind of self-selecting, if that makes sense, to say, oh, I'm really digging having a single malt that is reflective of the Pacific Northwest, like what we're doing here at Westland, or the guys in the Southwest with Santa Fe or Whiskey Del Bach, things like that. So I think it will happen in time, and I think you will have distilleries leaning into a locality aspect of it. I think that's just natural because you're looking for a place to differentiate.
Yeah.
If you're trying to make single malt, like, how do you stand out? Like for Westland, it's very easy. We've got 90% of the barley that comes from from Washington State. We've got a local species of oak that only grows in our region. We've got local peat. We have all these other things. So what are those things that help you just stand out and be relevant to a global whiskey market that is very well taken care of? It's never been a better time to be a whiskey drinker than right now. So having good whiskey is like the minimum. That's how you get in the door.
Yeah.
Let alone, be relevant to people. So you have to not just be making good whiskey, you have to be making compelling whiskey. So I think you'll see a lot of people doing that just to make very compelling whiskey. And you will see regional styles diverge from that, but I think it's going to take some time, realistically.
Well, and as you say that, right, it's really interesting because like a lot of people say the godfather of American single malt is McCarthy's, which is in Oregon, which isn't far from you all, which is a peated single malt, right? Like stylistically couldn't be completely different. Like it's a Lafroig type of whiskey comparative to what you all have, right? Like you do have some peat in your standard offering, which we talked about this beforehand, but this is not a shameless plug. This is a shameless plug. The new flagship is really, really good. I've probably drank my weight's worth in it in the last, hour since we've hung out. That would be actually a shit ton of whiskey. I've drank enough to know that
you've slimmed down. You've slimmed down a little bit.
I have slimmed down. Yeah. It's only 226.4.
Yeah. Weight Watchers.
That's what I was this morning. I flexed for everyone, and I don't know why. I'm slimmer, so I don't know why I flexed. But it's just really interesting because Seattle and where McCarthy's is in Oregon is not too far away, right? But stylistically, they were like, "Hey, we want peated whiskey or peated single malt." So I think it's going to be for the people that have crafted the whiskey for the longest. Let's stay to our style. Let's stay true to ourselves. Very American. We're going to do what we want to do, how we want to do it, as long as it's in these parameters, right?
Yeah, and I think McCarthy's is a great example because it's a great whiskey. But it was also, I believe, if I remember correctly, the original quote. Maybe it's still up on their website today. I haven't checked in at least a decade. But like Steve McCarthy wanted to recreate Lagavulin.
Yeah,
very simply. And rightfully so, Lagavulin's a great whiskey. So, but I think that's the difference in mentality. And he's since retired, but a very talented distiller at all. Like even the Clear Creek stuff, the eau de vies are just magic. Like I just absolutely adore that distillery. But I think that just from a mindset, you can make, that's my point. You could make a whiskey that is like a carbon copy of a Lagavulin or a clone of something else. And from a liquid quality standpoint, you can do something that's very interesting and maybe displays, and I'm not saying this about McCarthy's at all, but you could make something that displays no typicity of the area where you are. You know, you could be quite anonymous that way. But I think it's up to distilleries to decide that for themselves and ultimately for the consumer to decide what they want. Do you care about that sort of thing? And some people won't care, and that's fine. But I happen to think that we are in a time where there is a very exciting wave of people who are coming into whiskey, coming into spirits, who are looking for something that is representative of place, that is giving them an experience. I'm holding up a bottle that nobody will be able to see while they're listening to this, but I'm holding up a bottle of Gariana, and this is, a bottle of whiskey that has, whiskey matured in casks that only come from this little area. It's 30 miles wide on the I-5 corridor, and like this is evocative of this place that I live in right now, and I can send that around the world with no loss of degradation, whatsoever to that, and you're getting an experience of place. And that's not what whiskey has always been, to be fair. Whiskey can be a commodity. Whiskey can be something that feels like it's representative of place. And it's, if you look at the grand scheme of things, it's up to the changing tides of culture.
Yeah. No, I find that to be really interesting. And you've talked about these kind of like you said the term, damn it. Fuck. Like Lost Lantern. So you've talked about these like
independent bottlers.
And thank you. You've talked about these independent bottlers like Lost Lantern. You've not called them by name, but they've helped us explore a lot of different like American single malts, because they have their American vatted whiskey where they've plotted around to these American single malt categories and brought that, and they vatted one and created one. But that's how I knew about McCarthy's. Whiskey Del Bach was from American Mash and Grain. Like there's a lot of different things. I think that's what's unique about this, because there's so much regional distillate happening that you don't know what you don't know until you can find it through these independent bottlers around the country or blends that you may be able to sample.
I believe independent bottlers have a huge role to play in the next, coming years and decades of this category developing, because it is, the consequence of this highly dynamic, we've left open a lot of innovation. And I think just, America in general, like you got a lot of high highs, you also got a lot of low lows, like there'll be people who are making mistakes out there making whiskey. You've seen that in the craft whiskey space in general, but also, in American single malt. So a good independent bottler that you can know and trust. If you say, I like the style of Lost Lantern, we're bottling some stuff for Lost Lantern right now, by the way, if anybody's looking for some Lost Lantern stuff, it's, if you like, I trust them. And if they pick this, then I'm going to like it. That's a really important thing. And again, it kind of comes back, we were talking about earlier about how it's like the shock waves, the reverberations of this new category entering the scene is like, okay, this concept of an independent bottler, which didn't really exist completely in America so much until recently. It was very much a UK phenomenon, with, Scotch Malt Whisky Society, Gordon MacPhail, Berry Brothers and Rudd,
Signatory, right? Yeah,
exactly. So, but there's been like white labeled stuff for bourbon in America, but the idea of the independent bottler as a business of like, oh, buy my stuff, I'm signatory, anything I release is going to be excellent. That idea is beginning to transplant over here, which again, you can apply that not just to American single malts, but also then they can do that for other whiskeys too. Yeah. Like it's just it just helps to make the whole thing a lot more bountiful, the whole American whiskey scene a lot more bountiful.
No, that's super interesting, because I mean, we've kind of followed American single malt for the past 3 years of doing this podcast, and also followed people sourcing bourbon. And the perceptions of both are so wildly different, right? It's, sourcing bourbon, it's like, oh, we found some more MGP. and we're going to bottle it, and here it is. Or we're going to find some new 12-year-old Kentucky bourbon. We're not going to tell you where it's from, which is the source whiskey side of things. But the same thing is occurring with independent bottlers, but they're saying, look, we found some of the best Westland whiskey. We found some of the best McCarthy's whiskey, Cedar Ridge whiskey, and we want to bottle it, and we're putting our label on it, and we want to tell you about it. So discover this new distillery that you might not have ever heard of, or you might not have previously had access to, versus just saying, we bottled some whiskey. It's an American single malt. Don't worry about where it's from. It's 12 years old, or it's 5 years old, or it's 8 years old. Here's what's unique about it. But we're not going to tell you about who actually distilled it. So I think the perceptions are just wildly different.
Oh, but I think it just adds this new dimension, for folks. It helps. It gives people an easier, safer access point, into, if the independent bottler is one you can trust. So you got to be able to have that experience with independent bottlers. Single Cask Nation, another one we've worked with for a long time, here in the U.S. But yeah, is it primed for discovery? Does it help you get in and learn something, or is it just about like bottling something to take advantage of the category? And I'm sure, in fact, I guarantee you, over time, there will be somebody who gets into the independent bottler game that's just like, dang, American single malt's really hot, and I'm going to buy this. I'm not going to tell you where it's from because maybe the place that I sourced it from wasn't great. It doesn't matter because American single malt's super hot, and I'm going to sell it. And that's almost like a good problem to have. It shows that we made it, I guess, in American single malts. But what's happening right now between the distilleries in America making single malt and these new independent bottlers that are popping up is super interesting, and great for people who are whiskey drinkers. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because like the independent bottlers, are going to have these higher price points, right? And that was one of the things that I teased you beforehand is, right, this idea of mature Scotch whiskey, 12, 14 years at an approachable price, $55, $65, right? Whether you're talking about Glenfiddich 14, which I think is $65.99 here in the States, which is, their tagline used to be like from the rolling hills of Scotland to the rolling hills of Kentucky. So they're playing on ex-bourbon casks to get people super interested, or a Macallan 12 at Costco, I think is $55. One of the most like iconic Scotch brands. And a lot of these American single malts are coming in at very pricey points, right? 75, 80, 100, 125, like some of these independent bottlers. Like, how does a category start to recoup from people that are trying to compare them to the only other single malt they know, which is Scotch?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer is that to really understand the dynamics of pricing in this category in spirits is just like a fascinating subject in and of itself. Like the economies of scale that as a person who runs a distillery, the economies of scale that a big distilling plant has, and they'll call it a plant, is just massive. Even if you're using pot stills, in Scotch single malt, like how much more cheaply they can produce that distillate versus your average American single malt producer might literally be an order of magnitude, cheaper. And that's just kind of the way that it is. Now, the problem is that it's not, maybe before I say that, the upside to that is that it's not nearly as bad, I think, as competing against column still bourbon. If you try to break into the bourbon game, like there's very good bourbon for prices are changing, but have been traditionally very favorable prices, I would say. And it's just very difficult to compete with a column still that runs 24/7. And if you're doing like a batch process, like, even if you're sourcing the same ingredient, that's very difficult to make something that costs the same. So, but it doesn't matter, to a consumer, it doesn't matter at all. It's like I'm used to paying, I think you said it was like $55 for Macallan 12 at Costco. And Macallan 12 is a great whiskey, and it's a benchmark for single malt whiskey in this category. So we as a distillery as distillers have to go, okay, well, shit, how do we compete with Macallan 12, which is a very well-known, very well-respected distillery in Scotland, maybe, definitely amongst the kind of top of the top in terms of single malts out of Scotland, and is offering whiskey at this price. How can we justify the pricing that we have, even if it costs us way more to produce this whiskey? Because people ultimately don't care, realistically. So I think that's, for me, the perspective is that you need to offer something else. If you're just trying to offer a clone of the Macallan 12 or fill in the blank with whichever great, Scottish single malt you've got, and you're charging 40% more for it, like, you're going to lose, So, the thing that we're able to bring to the table, as whiskey makers at Westland is like, okay, we're using these dark roasted malts. We're using a Belgian brewer's yeast. We're using new American oak. All of these things are really big departures from Scotch single malts. When you taste our flagship whiskey, which, by the way, at $59.99, I'm very proud of that price point. When you taste that whiskey, like, you're getting an experience in single malt that is completely unlike what you would get from the entry-level flagship product of a Scotch whiskey. And I think my perspective is that most American distilleries will benefit from going this route, or you have to kind of eat it on price. There's a couple of distilleries or brands of American single malt that are releasing stuff at very low price point, $39.99. I know the economics of this business well enough to know that that's not really viable in the long run. But, this is a 20, 30, 40, 50-year proposition here. So, you could make no money. It's a very challenging game to get into this. You could make no money in the short term. That's a thing.
Yeah. That's one of the things I just have found like super fascinating as I've started to dip my toe into like Scotch whiskey is how do you take the individual, right, from Scotch to American single malt to bourbon, right, where we have discovered bourbon, and obviously because bourbon's in our back door, but like discovered American single malt, which has allowed us to discover Scotch. And I think that's going to be the unique play is bourbon drinkers have this unique connection because you all are putting out cask strength or 92 proof, where Macallan 12 is under 90 most of the time. I believe it's like 86. Like when you look at these proof points, like they're less, and people are like, oh, I want cask strength bourbon. Well, there's cask strength American single malt that is being released, or 100 plus proof, and you don't see that from a Scotch perspective. So you all are a natural bridge to bring a drinker down, right, from a proof point perspective into the wonders of, hey, barley's a more delicate grain. There's a lot more going on. You're finishing in Oloroso. You're maybe peated. You may be different woods. You may be used woods versus new wood, right? There's a lot of different characteristics that allow things to happen to get a lot more flavoring out of it. And so it's got to be more delicate. The proof has to be lower, but it packs a punch. And so, you mentioned, the thoughtfully made Westland, which has been a year in the making, that's been out in the market at 92 proof. I've been drinking this all night and it's lovely. It's a great whiskey, got a lot of character, depth, slight touch of peat that gives you like a conifer, but it's also like chocolatey and fruity. And people don't realize there's a ton of flavor that can happen at lower proof whiskeys. And I think American single malt will bridge the gap because you can get cask strength, but then you can come in that 90 to 100 proof to get people thinking about the category that ultimately would bridge them to Scotch. So you can kind of run the gamut. I know I went on a little like kind of tangent there, but like what are your thoughts on that?
I think in general, the ability for American single malt to bridge the gap between Scotch whiskey and American whiskeys, which for most people is bourbon, is immense. And it starts with a familiarity that comes with new American oak. I mean, in our flagship whiskey, we're using about 60% of the casks are new American oak, freshly charred new American oak. A couple different char levels. We use all slow grown oak, air dried staves, really higher quality grade of oak that breaks down the tannins in the wood and things like that. But ultimately, it's the same kind of base, familiar flavor profile that's in American whiskeys that people know and love. So when you make the jump into American single malt, there's a lot of whiskeys, whether it's from Westland or it's from other producers, it's like, okay, this is this familiarity that I know and that I understand, right? Which is this flavor profile of American oak. And I think that's really important. It's why our flagship whiskey has that a big part of its flavor profile. But malt has this extra dimension. And I think, people who are really attracted to really high strength whiskeys, they're searching out a lot of flavor. And I think a lot of bourbon, when people get into it, that is just really low proof, it's just been very tamed. It's just like you get a lot of, you read these classic tasting notes. It's caramel, it's vanilla. It's like, they're just getting oak. And what they're really interested in are these crazy esters that come out. They're looking for stuff that's non-cast strength. But you can do that actually at lower strengths if you're just clever with how you distill things. And they're using flavorful raw ingredients. So like what we're doing with malts, where we're using 5 different types of malted barley, 6 if you include the peat, but 5 main ones that have these dark roasted flavors, the Belgian yeast. So even with that familiar safe space, so to speak, of the new American oak, those caramel, vanilla, coconut notes, you also have the nutty notes, the chocolates, the pastries, and stuff like that. So the thing is, if you might not care about that at all, and that's the interesting thing about actually going abroad and selling whiskey. I was in September, I was doing Whiskey Live Paris and Whiskey Show London, and their palates are totally different, compared to the American whiskey palate. And we can make all of these different things. We have whiskey, Colere, which is very focused on barley variety flavor. But we're able to adapt. I think that's the nice part of what you see in American whiskey. And part of the definition that we crafted is you can use new oak, used oak, charred, just toasted, uncharred. Not that anybody would want to go completely raw oak. You could if you wanted to, I guess. But it allows us to match that palate of the American consumer and find what people want. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make whiskey that people want to drink.
Yeah, and to be honest, you all have converted a bourbon drinker into this category. Like, I think Scott and I both have started to enjoy American single malt, where we want to have one on our bar back ourselves, right? Like whether it's Santa Fe and the Colkegan, or if it's Balcones or yourself or Westland or Westward, right? There's just a variety that I always want to have on my bar back. Scott, I don't know about you, but like I love the variety that I can get from American single malt.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times I've told friends and family and acquaintances, I've got a bourbon podcast. I'm like, well, what's your favorite bourbon? And I'm starting to talk about other spirits and about what's also out there that's not on the shelf, or that's not regularly on the shelf, or that they might need to seek out. And so you also need to try other things. And I never thought I would have said this 3-4 years ago, but American single malt is one of the things I point people to say, look, if you're not paying attention, and I've said this on the podcast, if you're not paying attention to American single malt, you're going to be behind the power curve, and it's going to take you some time to catch up. Everybody knows what bourbon is. That's obviously what I'm most passionate about. That's what I love. I'm from Kentucky, and I like my corn whiskey. But if you're not familiarizing yourself with additional spirits, rye whiskey, it's generally not my thing. But like American single malt, like it's worth exploring because there is so much variety. There is so much experimentation. There is so many up and coming distilleries. Established distilleries too are doing it, but there are so many distilleries just to explore that you really can't go wrong and just try to seek out something new, and even do a tasting side by side with the bourbon, and you'll figure out why it's so different.
Yeah, it takes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'll just say you'll see a lot of similarities in some of these products where they're using, new charred American oak. Like that is what bourbon drinkers seek out. It's that char flavor. That's what it is. It's not just corn, which I love corn whiskey, but it's not just corn. It's new charred American oak. That is one of the predominant factors of American whiskey. It's American bourbons are new charred oak. So you can find that in a lot of American single malts.
Yeah, totally. And that's the beauty of the category, and the diversity of the category is just to be able to offer so many different things. I mean, this is like, forgive me for sounding ridiculously over the top here, but like the beauty of America is that we are all a bunch of different people crammed into one continent, living completely different lives.
It's called the melting pot.
The melting pot. To use that classic example, and it's not just different people, but we're in different places. I mean, we're in deserts, we're in rainforests. We're in places that grow corn, we're in places that grow rye, we're in places that grow barley. We're in hot aging climates, we're in cold aging climates. So just as a way to lean into all of it, it's just like when people is like, oh, what is the flavor profile of like American single malt? Like, no. Like think about America in general as a whole. Like America is this big melting pot, to use that terminology, and it's reflected. You see it today. It's like actively happening. You see that with people who are, making single malt around the US. It's hugely diverse. Will it stay that way forever? I hope it does, to a certain degree. I hope that it doesn't homogenize around a certain particular flavor profile, because I think that's part of the magic of what we got today. And you can find the familiar entry point. A lot of distilleries like Westland are offering something that's like, okay, if you like American whiskeys, you buy our flagship product, whatever it is, get in here. But you can also have something that is like completely off the wall, that is like, well, this is because this yeast only comes from this region, or, like us, like there's this peat bog that grows here that only has this type of moss in it, or whatever. And you can have all of those things. And that as a thing to be able to offer the category of whiskey, of American whiskey, and just say, look, this is America broadly. Like, I think that's a really, really cool thing. Like, even if you love Kentucky and you love the history that comes with that, this is America,
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And, I find it really interesting. You talk about the peat and the peat bog that you all are going to potentially be doing some stuff with. Peat Week is not too far away either, right?
Yeah. So,
I felt like you were bringing me there, and I just had to go there.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Why not? Yeah. I just, I went fishing. So, we have been distilling. So we had this thing called Peat Week, which is a week-long celebration, of peat, where we were, mashing, distilling peated whiskey at the distillery in Seattle. It's the only time of year that we released a heavily peated whiskey. So it's just a ton of fun. It's just a big festival that we would do usually January, of every year. But we're now at this point where the peated whiskey that we've been distilling at a local peat, which we started doing in January of 2016, is getting ready to be released. And we're super, super excited by that. It's not super heavily peat. It's not trying to be Octomore, but it's, it's about 15, 20 part per million, about equivalent to our normal Westland peated expression. But it's Washington State peat. It's from a bog 90 minutes drive away from the distillery. It kind of has this like peat meets mezcal beats like forest floor earthiness thing going on to it. And we're going to celebrate that by kind of taking what was Peat Week and transitioning that into like the Solum, which is what we call this whiskey, Solum, release week. So it's you'll see a lot of themes from Peat Week, but it's just going to be all about celebrating this new whiskey Solum edition 1. So we're super stoked on it. Honestly, the only thing that's standing in our way right now is having a hard time getting bottles delivered on time. So it's a little delayed, but it should be out in March. Most places around the US, not just in the tasting room, but the good whiskey shops around America should be out in March. So I'm super, super excited by that.
And I find that interesting because I was looking at just like the Peat Week, the marketing was around like circus-esque, right? Like it was kind of like a big play, a big to do, right? Like Ringling Brothers is kind of how I felt. And so that's pretty cool that you all are taking the locality of Seattle and like bringing that forth and like this big, like, come all, like, let me tell you about like peated American single malt, which I find to be like pretty cool.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad you enjoyed that, because that for us, it was really fun. The kind of circus theme of the whole thing was great on so many levels. The first of it was like, okay, there's this, a lot of our brand identity and kind of visual aspects is like this kind of late 19th century, the way things were done in the western part of North America, just the way things looked visually. But also the idea of a heavily peated whiskey, which is what we're going to release with each peat week, is an oddity for us. Our Westland peat expression is much more balanced and peat. So it's like, okay, this idea of an oddity, is just like the whole Ringling Brothers idea of just like, come see crazy stuff, like that idea. And it's a very American, like way over the top, sensationalized way to kind of visually demonstrate that was just a ton of fun. And our designers, like all the materials to draw upon is just like insane, So, that as a release series that we've done has been super exciting. So that's when people find those releases, and they are very limited out there. It's just to be able to lean into this, like, this is crazy. This is a one-time event, one time a year. But it's also this classically American, way over the top event that we've made it into. And we would do the same thing at the distillery. We do cocktail competitions and all sorts of other, fun things. So yeah, it's been really fun, but I'm so excited for Solom to come out.
I love the word oddity, right? Because it is a show, right? And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, we should should we not be having fun? This is whiskey after all. And I think this is the ability to put out a thing, especially like as whiskey makers, like here is this one thing that we've never made before, like a release flavor profile that we've never made before. And then we'll do like, we had these things, we call it these symposiums during Peat Weeks, where it's just like, will anybody show up if we like give like a PowerPoint presentation on like the phenolic profile of all these things and like how we made this whiskey? And it turned out, yes, we would sell them out in minutes. But it's just an opportunity to show people something we've never done before and kind of flex those creative muscles. So why not?
Yeah.
So the guy that runs this peat bog, this is a business for him. Who is making peat for what purpose?
So the funniest part about this whole thing, so this guy who runs this peat bog, so there's only one peat bog that is commercially harvested in Washington State that I'm aware of. Now there's 50,000 acres of peat in Washington State. This peat bog is allowed to be harvested. It's sitting on a spring. So it's actually one of the big problems with harvesting peat is that it releases a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere when the bog is drained, which we generally want to avoid. So when the bog remains flooded, you only basically release the greenhouse gases that come with burning peat, which is, for us, it was like an entire year's worth of burning peat is equivalent to one transatlantic flight from Seattle to London and back. It's like one seat in coach, not the whole flight, like one seat in coach. So we're able to use this peat bog to harvest to make this locally peated whiskey. But this guy was he was a detective. So he basically, and his main beat was like on drug dealers and drug growers in the kind of really, really rural regions of Washington State. So when he retired, he said, okay, I want to have a retirement job. Here's this, peat bog. And he bought it, little tiny small business. And now his main customer is marijuana grow operations, because of course weed has been legal in Washington State since 2012. And they use peat as part of the soil building that they have in these marijuana grow operations, which I think is just hysterical. And he actually has a great attitude about it. But actually the main reason, it's funny because a lot of people,
all the people that have had any marijuana charges have been pardoned by the President of the United States.
That's true.
Federally.
Federal
charges.
Federally. But things have changed. So it's not like a big deal. It's Washington State. So like, who cares?
Party on,
but,
right?
Freedom, right?
That's right.
Where's the eagle?
So the main place that peat goes to, he doesn't harvest peat to go for peated whiskey. He harvests peat for two things: for soil stuff, for the gardening soil, but also as a spill absorber. It turns out that peat is actually like a really, really good natural absorber of liquids that spill. It'll soak up to, I think it's like nearly 1,000% of its weight in liquid. So like if you hear about like a tanker truck or something like spilling on a road, a lot of times they'll have like a peat like soil solution that they'll throw out there. It'll just be a big kind of sponge, that'll soak stuff up. So, it's used their stuff the guy creates is like used in the military for, cleaning up chemical spills and by fire departments and things like that. And even in Scotland, I mean, there was a big article in, one of the whiskey magazines a couple of years ago about how even in Scotland, where peat is a big part of like, you'd think it's used everywhere in Scotch whiskey. It's literally like a rounding error in terms of how much peat is used compared to other industries in Scotland.
Well, and like Scotch peat is like running out, right? Like it's endangered almost.
It's protected. It's not running out, I wouldn't say. Yeah. It's protected because it regenerates really slowly, which is true. And it's a good carbon sink, or at least it has been. One of the challenging things though is like, if you have, let's say you've got an acre of land and you're trying to sequester carbon, the best way to do it is not actually with peat. It's like grow a forest. A forest is going to pull much more carbon out of the atmosphere today. So that's where like the peat bog that we source from today, the fact that it remains flooded means that, when a bog is dried out, you have this methane going to the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide going to the atmosphere. We don't have any of that. And the ecology of the bog is not broken. So the whole unique flora and fauna of that region stays in place. We're just harvesting, it literally looks super disgusting. Like you're just like scooping out with a backhoe from like the bottom of the bog. So it's not even harvesting anything living. And you get this goopy, sludgy mess, that you take out. But that's more sustainable to harvest it that way, which is a good thing to work towards.
So was this the botany portion of the podcast?
Well, don't try to pin me into knowing anything about the plants that grow in these bogs.
You said flora and fauna. That was enough for me.
Yeah, that's it. That's all I got.
Well, I just think it's interesting because a lot of people are like, oh, it's peat. That means it's smoky and everything else. But peat it's just a fascinating thing that is used for a lot of different things. So I'm glad you explored that a little bit.
Oh, sure. There's all sorts of the things that grow in our bog are totally different. There's 11 different types of sphagnum mosses alone that grow in Washington state peat bogs. You've got wild cranberries, wild crab apples. You've got a plant called Labrador tea, which, is a deciduous plant, drops its leaves. So like they're just fascinating little ecosystems, and that results in a flavor profile that is completely unique and fascinating as well.
So, we've talked a lot about peat, but you've also done some really cool finishing casks, right? Like in your single barrel profile. And I know one that got acclaim was from one of our friends, Rare Bird, or most people that know him like Wild Turkey Fanatic 101 is what I like to call him, even though he's Rare Bird 101. They did a tequila finish, right? Like, what's it like to not only just play with peat, but play with all these other finishing casks in American single malt to bring out different flavor profiles so that people can play with those unique flavors of the malted barley and of the different finishes that you put on them?
Well, that's the amazing thing, right? Is you could have all these different philosophies. Like for us at Westland, we're really, really unique. We're not completely unique in America, but like our use of dark roasted malts that you have like in our flagship whiskey, the Belgian yeast, all these things, and the new American oak, that creates a certain new dimension of flavor profiles that you can work with. Now you can have those things on their own, but also like how those things interact with other things becomes very interesting. So maybe it's like, oh, the dark roasted malts and new American oak works really well together, which it does. Oh, but also like it does really cool things with PX casks. Or maybe it does really cool things with peat with tequila casks. That's the fun part about injecting just a new dimension of flavor profile into whiskey in general, is just if you're willing to roll with it and to say, how can we use this with kind of the other finishing cask concepts that exist out there to create something new. So when we did these, the past year, we did a lot of single cask releases, and we'll have it for a couple more years. We've got some, we've got some Madeira, some Banyuls, some port, some Sauterne, some, all sorts of crazy stuff, some vermouth, like some Amaro cat, like, there's all sorts of really interesting things out there, and how those things play together is really fun. And I think that's the best way to use a single cask program. So what we've done a lot of. And we don't have those a lot in our core range whiskeys. So when you see that as a single cask, actually for Westland, it is quite unique.
Give me all the Banyuls that you have. I had one with High West and like fell in love. Give me all the Banyuls.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It is pretty cool, I have to say.
The sweetness of it, like, and like all the like fresh fruit that it brought forward. Sign me up for all the Banyuls cask. I had no clue what the hell it was, and I had to do a lot of Googling and a lot of research on it just to like kind of figure out what it was. And I was like, where can I get a Banyuls? And I like couldn't find one in Kentucky.
I'm locking you in. That's a binding verbal contract that all of your listeners just heard here.
Yes. Yeah. So there was a lot that happened. And I like literally drank a half a bottle while it was snowing. I was like, if it's snowing, I'm drinking. That was what I put on like Instagram at the time. And it snowed a lot in like the 4 days, and I drank the whole bottle. It was a hangover from hell. But what I've realized is that in this conversation that we waited way too long in between podcasts to talk to Westland, because you all are doing so much to not only just focus on American single malt as a category, but as yourselves, right? Like they're two in the same, right? And I find that to be really unique and interesting, is that you're pushing this category forward as a collective, but you're also, hey, we need to forge this forward as Westland. And that's what I think is beautiful in this. And over the last 2 years out of the pandemic, you all have blossomed into, I think, the flagship American single malt that people really, really know in the consumerism perspective as this comes out. And I think that's what is exciting as these rules and regulations get put in place, is Westland is positioned really well for success.
Well, thank you for saying that. We are, this is a cliche, but like the rising tide lifts all boats thing definitely is true. I think Westland is best seen with context, to understand America. So when people taste things and go like, what am I tasting? Like sometimes they're like, oh, I'm tasting malt for the first time in a single malt whiskey, or even in an American whiskey. It's like, oh, these are flavors that are like really cool, but like I've never tasted something like this in a whiskey before. And then as soon as you add other American single malts, this, like, oh, American single malt could be this, it could be that. And so Westland is carving out its own space to do this. But that's why, it's, as a category, is so special. Is it's not just us. We do have our perspective, the way that we make our whiskey and our philosophy. But, if it's also not for you, like there is other space. We're confident in what we do and in the liquid, even if you don't care about the philosophy, we're confident in our liquid. And, we try to put stuff out there that, that a lot of different people can get into, whether it's our flagship whiskey or more esoteric stuff. But that's the name of the game. Like, we're not, the American single malt producers are not, people ask us all the time, like, who's your biggest competitor? Like, it's definitely not like the nearest American single malt producer. It's, like we may be competitors theoretically, but our biggest competitor is just being known against, Scotch single malt whiskey, so it's a good crew. American single malt's a good space. And, I do think I think I would agree. Yeah. I think Westland's positioned really nicely in there. Is a lot of hard work in the future, to keep that going. This is not a one and done thing. We got to keep releasing amazing whiskeys and keep coming out with new, cool, interesting stuff that people want to like. But I do think we have some really interesting stuff that people will enjoy. So,
yeah. Well, Matt, we really appreciate you joining the Bourbon Lens tonight. I think it's super interesting about just all the work the American Single Malt Commission has done to really push forward this category. Over the next few months, everyone should be on the lookout for the definition, because it should probably happen during the holiday season, which is the busiest season in just whiskey in general in the States. And go and buy an American single malt. More importantly, go and buy a Westland bottle for someone during the holiday season, because it's huge. And it means a lot to these brands as they go from the red to the black during the holiday season, because it's whiskey drinking season. So, Matt, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, where can people find out more about Westland and where they could go buy a bottle over the holiday season as we release this podcast?
So you can find out more about us at westlanddistillery.com. Very simple. I definitely recommend, if you've got a good local retailer, check in with them, ask them about us at Westland. Hopefully they're carrying us in a lot of major metro areas. That's true, but it's, the whiskey scene around America in terms of distribution is quite complex. So yeah, we hope that people can reach out, and people have questions, like, don't hesitate to reach out. Like, literally, you could just cold call, email. So we have people do that before, actually not that infrequently. Just I have a question about this, and maybe this is the wrong place to ask. No, we'll answer that question about what we do. We were once called alarmingly transparent by an intellectual property attorney. So of the way that we talk about how we make stuff. So, if people are curious, they can ask us, and, go out and support your retailer and support American Single Malts this season. And, frankly, this is what a great time to be okay, this is history that is happening right now. If you've got a whiskey friend, a whiskey buddy, or you're going to a party or something, hey, American Single Malt, this is a thing that's happening right now. And let's try one, or let's try a few, or let's try some of these against Scotch whiskeys, or let's try some of these against bourbon whiskeys. What a thing to be able to think back 10 years from now and go, yeah, as American Single Malt was becoming official, we were doing this in that moment. I think this tis the season, right? To do so. This will never happen again. This moment of history that we're living through. So enjoy it.
I think you nailed it there. I mean, that's kind of what we've done with this podcast. I said, if you're not paying attention, you're going to be behind the power curve. So now's the time.
Yeah. Find it super interesting. I'm right there with you. Go and buy an American Single Malt. If you're in Louisville, Total Wine, I know, carries it. I know Liquor Barn carries Westland. So go and grab one. It's super easy. We'll be posting links, show notes, all the information. Once you get on their website, they have a whole shop where you can figure out all that information, all the good stuff on westlanddistillery.com. So, Matt, we really appreciate you joining the Bourbon Lens tonight. And as always, thanks everyone for listening to this episode. We really appreciate it. If you don't mind, give us a 5-star review and like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate that. You can follow us and know more about us at bourbonlens.com, as well as Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. And again, you can follow everything that Westland's doing at Westland on all their social medias. Super easy to figure out. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks so much, guys.